In this one I'm going to show you my most recent over-the-board game I played recently for Chesterfield. I'm not going to spoil it, I'm going to let you find out who wins by watching the game. I'll try and make it as instructive, educational and least boring as possible. So let's just get into it. I play e4, he plays e5, knight to f3, knight to f6, d4 and d6. I immediately pin the knight, relieving some pressure on this e4 pawn by pinning it to the queen. He copycats me here, and this is my opponent's only mistake of the game, to be honest. It loses the pawn on the spot by me taking on e5. After the bishop takes, I take the g-pawn, and he plays h6. I take the knight, damaging the structure like myself on the king side. Because this pawn on e5 is here, he couldn't take with the queen, so he takes on d6, bishop takes d6, knight c3, a6, queen to d2, preparing to castle queen side. My opponent plays knight to c6, I castle, and my opponent plays queen to d7, and I see this as an attempt to castle queen side. So I stop it by playing h4. If my opponent castles now queen side, I play bishop to h3, skewering the queen to the king, and my opponent might as well resign. If my opponent tries to block, I just take again with the bishop, and my opponent might as well just resign or take the bishop on f5. So my opponent sees this, he doesn't castle, and instead he plays rook to d8. Play knight to d5 here. The reason I played knight to d5, the level that we're playing at, it's pretty obvious that if he allows me to play knight takes on f6, he loses the game immediately because it would fork this king and queen. So he stops it by playing queen to e6. This is an inaccuracy. Stockfish prefers him to play king to f8, allowing me to take this pawn, or covering the pawn with bishop to e7 instead. But he defends it this way. Like again, as I was saying, the purpose of this knight here. Sorry, I didn't tell you what the purpose actually was. It was to take away this runaway square on e7 for the queen. As you say, he plays a lazy move. Let's say b5. I'd play bishop to h3 now. And this queen's got nowhere to run. Again, if he plays f5, I just take f5 and the queen's trapped. So, sorry. Knight to d5, queen to e6, bishop to h3 anyway, queen to e5, and I play f4. This knight nicely defends the f4 pawn. And as my opponent, okay, give it up. You play queen to h5, the only square. The queen seems safe. I take on f6 and fork the king and queen. So my opponent's only move really is to play the queen to d4. Now, actually, I was surprised to find this in the analysis that up to this point, the only mistake my opponent made was right at the beginning, bishop to g4, pinning my knight to my queen. After that, my opponent made no mistake. It's been a near perfect game. Just the odd inaccuracy here and there made. So to be able to say that my opponent didn't make another mistake from there on and managed to keep the pressure on, keep adding pressure, keep adding threats, managed to win a piece, in fact, with the only move, queen to d4, queen takes d4, rook takes d4. I'm up a knight and a pawn here. So after the bishop to g4 mistake my opponent made early on, he'd made no more mistakes, and I managed to win a piece. So I'm quite proud of myself for that. Bishop takes f4 check. I move out of the way with king to b1. Hammering on the f6 pawn, so my opponent plays back, covering it. I play the rook back to d3 just so it's covered for in case my opponent plays c6, kicking the knight away. My opponent plays c5. I play f4 again. The knight again nicely covers the f4 pawn. I'm trying to remove the defense of the f6 pawn. So my opponent plays d4. I play c3, kicking the bishop away, and now I take on f6 with check. King to e7. I remove the rook. He retakes, and then I close the door of the position again with check by playing knight to d5. King to d6, and now there was no need for me to do what I did here. My position is absolutely fine and completely winning. This knight is a monster, and it's never going to get opposed unless he swaps the rook for it. And this bishop could just come to f5. This would have been a completely fine move. This pawn's covered, this pawn's covered, this knight's covered, this bishop's covered. How the hell is he going to oppose these? There's no pawns that can attack these pieces, and there's no piece that's ever going to take on e or f4. I did look at this, and I strongly considered it, but for some strange reason, I took my foot off the gas and played e5 just to try and simplify the position further and remove this bishop at the cost of a couple of pawns. So the opponent takes on d5. I play rook to d1, knowing that he's got to block with the bishop, otherwise he loses the rook, which is what he does. C takes on d4, king to e4, and my king to c2. C takes d2, rook to e1, check. King takes on f4, and another inaccuracy from me was to immediately play e6. Better for me would have been to play king to d3 immediately, but I played e6 after f takes on e6. I retake with the rook. He plays h5, stopping me from taking on h6. Now I played king to d3. He goes for the bishop, which is what I saw. I hoped bishop to f5, letting him take the h4 pawn, which he does, and now I play the rook to g6, and this king can never move. This is it. This king's trapped, and my opponent resigned. So spoiler alert, I won this game. Unfortunately, it was a 5-board game, Chesterfield against the other club. I shall not name the other club, just in case it upsets somebody. But anyway, we unfortunately lost 3-2. Fortunately, I was one of the 2 games that our club won, which I was quite relieved about, because the past few over-the-board games for the English Chess Federation, I've lost. My game before this one, I drew. So I was quite relieved to see my opponent resign here. He's noticing that this king's stuck. If he ever loses the d4 pawn by removing this rook from its defense, he's got nothing else to play for. What I'm sort of going to play for here, if, let's say, the rook came to d5, I'd probably play the king to e4, defending this bishop. The rook would probably realistically come back to d8, as, let's say, he took the bishop. This pawn would never promote, because the rook would just come back to g1, d1, and then win it. What I would probably play for here would be rook to g1 anyway, asking my opponent what he wants to do. Whatever he plays here, my next move is going to be king to f4, and straight after rook to h1 with a mate. The king can't move, even with the rook on g1. Rook covers all of the g file, and the bishop covers this little diagonal here. So the king's trapped. The black king is trapped. Maybe he's got to give up this rook. We did play a what would happen in the game after my opponent resigned, and I actually carried on playing a little bit fancy. I swapped this bishop for these 2 pawns and just shoved these pawns up with the support of the king after removing the d4 pawn, and my opponent had, well, he couldn't stop my A and B pawn. I've got a queen and just basically rickrolled him, if you want to call it that. So yeah, good game by my opponent. There was only one mistake made by him, which was right at the beginning, bishop to g4. It was this move. The only mistake made in the game. I think I made 2, maybe 3 inaccuracies. My opponent made 2, maybe 3 inaccuracies. But again, this was the only mistake made in the game. So it was a fairly accurate game. And yeah, I just kept up the pressure. Every move I made came with a threat, with a threat that needed tending to immediately. So I forced my opponent to play a very reactive game. He had to react all the time. I never let him play his stuff. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any details on my opponent in the English Chess Federation database. It's not even like he was a new player, because if he was a new player, he'd just be unrated. I'd like to give you a rated of my opponent, but I can't, unfortunately. So yeah, there's no information on my opponent for you here, and I'm sorry. If I find out in the future, I'll add it to this video. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I've covered everything. Hopefully it was not boring. Hopefully it was entertaining, instructive, educational, whatever you want to call it. Any good feedback, any bad feedback, I'll take it on the chin. If it's good, let me know. I'll keep doing it. If it's bad, let me know. I'll stop doing it. Likes, please don't give me any dislikes. Any likes, subscribes, massively appreciated. I am still very new to this. So yeah, hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Catch you later.